Hello everybody, and welcome back to my Devlog series. In my last video I showed my process of creating the very basic elements of my game. Today I'll show you some of the mini improvements that I've made, the new content I've created, as well as my overall plan for how I'm going to be structuring my game. Hope you guys enjoy. So, for the most part, the basic mechanics of the game were already pretty well set up, but there were a few things that felt a bit awkward and kind of out of place. One of the bigger issues was how I was handling the player firing their cannons. Before, I had it so that the player had one cooldown timer for all of their cannons that was shared. If the cooldown was done and you're holding the fire button, all of the cannons go off at once and the timer resets. And for the most part, the system is fine, but I did want it to be a bit more dynamic and honestly just more interesting. Someone actually left a comment on the last video suggesting that the cannonballs should be fired with a delay rather than just firing all at once, and that's exactly what I did. Now, each of the player's cannons are independent from each other, and they have their own cooldown timers. That allows me to randomize each cannon's firing rate slightly so that there's a bit more chaos and unpredictability to the player shooting. This fixes the problem if you already have been firing for a bit, but with this logic your cannons will still fire off all at once if you haven't been attacking for a while. So I've also set up a cannon manager script for the player that checks if all the cannon cooldown timers are ready, and if so, it will fire off each cannon with a slight delay so that they're not all firing at the same moment. Problem solved. Another benefit of making the cannons independent is to allow me to give each of them their own data. Firing rate, damage, any special effects, that sort of thing. Even though this seems like a pretty small thing, I've noticed while testing the game that it makes a really big difference to how the game feels. It's a lot more lively and dynamic and interesting, which is exactly what I wanted to do. All of those changes are great, but there is still one problem that I haven't been able to figure out yet. See, when you hold fire, all of your cannons fire off, but sometimes when you're in battle around one enemy ship and you're kind of circling around them, trying to shoot them, it looks kind of goofy to be shooting out of both sides of their ship because you're only facing them on one side. I'd like for the player to only fire from the side that's facing the enemy. I tried a bunch of different ways to make that happen, and I've already fixed it with the enemies. Whenever an enemy is in attack range with the player, each cannon will calculate an angle between itself and the player, and it will only fire if it's below a certain threshold. It's easy just to tell the enemies where the player is in the code because there's only one player. On the other hand, the enemies can spawn in and die, and there's more than one of them on the screen at one time, and as far as I can tell, there's not really a great way to keep track of it in the code. I tried a few things, but at best, none of them really worked out properly, and my worst idea of doing a really complicated physics calculation each time the cannon tries to fire took my frame rate down from about 140 or so to 12, so not going to go with that solution. If any of you have an idea of how I could pull this off, please leave your suggestions in the comments, but for now this is just going to be a problem for future me. So in addition to these new improvements, we've also got new content. As much as I love the little enemy ships that I have in the game already, I'm definitely going to need to add a bit more variety to keep the game interesting. First up is the shark. This little guy will head straight to your ship and try and take a bite out of your hull. I had a lot of fun making the animations for these guys. They do a little chomp at the side of the boat whenever they attack, and a very overly dramatic breach and dive when you kill them. At first they just stopped moving on death and went limp, but I'm a dirty vegan and sharks are cool, so instead of that, they're just gonna get scared off and dive back into the water. No shark murder in my game is allowed. Next up, we've got our little turrets. These are little towers that have 360-degree aim, but they're totally stationary. At the moment, they're not attackable, and they act more of like an environmental hazard, but I may end up changing them later on so the player can actually destroy them. I'm not sure yet. I think having these scattered throughout levels just makes the environment a bit more lively, and it makes the world feel like it's actually inhabited. Next up, I've got these new little raft guys. They're not the most sturdy ship, obviously, but they're able to throw projectiles directly at you. They don't need to be perfectly lined up on their side like the other ships. They're also meant to be equipped with special weapons that give certain status effects to the player, and that leads me to the next bit of new stuff. That's right, we got status effects. I wanted to add more elements that affect the gameplay as you progress through the levels, so one way to accomplish this is to add various buffs to the player's stats, or new abilities that will stack up and make you more powerful throughout the game. So, I got to work and implemented a buff and debuff system. For the most part, this was pretty simple to implement. I essentially just have a script that keeps track of a list of status effects that are active, and each effect has various data points for things like its strength, its duration, the actual effect it causes, obviously, things like that. I've got permanent effects that once obtained will stick with you through the end of your run and can greatly increase your power as you progress. Right now I've just got some pretty basic ones, things like a buff to your movement speed, decreasing the amount of damage you take, increasing your damage dealt, that sort of stuff. But with the system in place, it should be really easy for me to add other effects in the future. And as always, if you've got any suggestions for things you'd like to see, let me know. In addition to the more permanent buffs, I've also got temporary status effects that can be applied by enemies or power-ups that you collect. The raft enemies that I showed earlier can shoot flaming cannonballs that cause the player player to catch on fire and add a little damage over time effect to you. I've also got these harpoon throwing rafts that will temporarily slow down the player when hit. Honestly, the harpoon doesn't really make much sense, so I'd like to replace it with like a chain shot, which is a cannon projectile that damages the sails and rigging of ships, which I think will make a bit more sense. I need to actually create a model for that though, so that's again another problem for future me. I'd also like to add a grape shot, which is meant to damage infantry. I'm thinking maybe this could affect your firing speed since your crew would be like hurt, so they're not able to fire as quickly. Lastly, the sharks that I've already added will sometimes drop a little bowl of soup that will increase your shoot speed. Originally I was gonna drop like shark meat or something, but again, vegan, so we're not doing that. I think my thought process behind this was that your crew is like well fed after you pick it up so they shoot faster. I don't know. At least the soup looks pretty cool, I think. So, following the theme of making the game more dynamic and interesting and random, you can now obtain different types of cannons as you progress through the game. This edition works really well with the independent cannons that I added earlier, so now each cannon on board the player's ship can be assigned with a certain actual type of cannon with different stats and effects. Right now I've only got the standard cannon as well as one that shoots flaming cannonballs, but I can really easily add more unique cannons in the future with the system already set up. Each cannon type can have its own damage, firing rate, projectile type, and it can also apply different effects to enemies. I think this will go a long way towards improving the gameplay, and depending on what types of cannons I add in the future, it can go a long way to add a variety of playstyles for the game. So with all the new stuff I've got, it's probably worth taking a minute to go over how I actually plan on structuring the game itself. The game I had built at the end of the previous devlog was essentially just a glorified game jam game. While it was fun, it did get old after about 5 minutes or so. I want my final game to have some elements of exploration, but doing a full open world game would be way too much for me to create. I also want the game to have a concrete story, although by no means will it be the main focus. I thought for a while about what type of game I'd like to make, but eventually I decided to take some major inspiration from one of my favorite games that I've ever played, which is Hades. Now, there's no way that I'm going to be able to create a game on the same level of depth and polish, and all of that is Hades, but I think I can borrow some of the structure and ideas it uses to help me plan out this game. So, the basic structure of the game is going to be a roguelite. If you're unfamiliar with it, the basic premise of a roguelite is that you start the game at a relatively weakened state, you play through some randomly generated levels, you collect random power-ups that slowly grow the player's power, and usually, at first, you'll die well before reaching the end of the game. On death, you're sent all the way back to the beginning, though many games will have keep certain currencies or things like that that can be used to permanently upgrade your character. This is a concept called meta progression. I think this structure will work really well for the game. I can have a little home hub area where you prepare for each run, and that can have things like a player port, the existing shop that I've already built with the ship upgrades, and other shops where you'll use gold and other materials that you collect along your runs to improve your stats. Another thing that I love about Hades in particular is how it actually structures its levels and its game art, and that's something I'd really like to heavily borrow as well. Hades is comprised of 4 main themed worlds, with around 12 or so randomly chosen levels in each world. In the middle of each world, there's usually a mini-boss or extra difficult encounter. You can find shops along the way, you'll pick up power-ups and upgrades, and at the very end of each world there's a final boss that must be defeated before moving on to the next region. I think this approach will be relatively manageable for me. I think having a large set of handcrafted levels that are randomly chosen will be a lot easier for me to implement than generating fully random procedural levels. It also allows me more control over each level, so I can make sure they're balanced and interesting to play through. So far I've made a few basic test levels, and I've also set up a level manager system that chooses which level to present to you next based on your progress. I have, however, made a few levels that are a bit more interesting that I'd like to show you. So earlier I showed off the new buff and debuff system, but I didn't actually show how you'll obtain the more permanent upgrades. Well, meet this lady. That's right, we got a witch, or druid, or shaman, or something, I don't really know yet. She's got a nice little house on a spooky island where you'll be presented with a choice between 3 randomly picked upgrades. In the middle of your run, you'll be able to visit her shop and pick up one of her upgrades that'll help you grow stronger and progress. By no means am I totally finished with her environment, but I think the small island that I've built for her is really cool, and the atmosphere is really nice as well. I'll definitely be adding some more flair to her shop in the future. Maybe she can perform a ritual or hand you a potion or something like that. For now, I've got the code working, and that's enough for me at the moment. Similar though to our new witch character, we have a cannonsmith. He also lives on a little island, but it's not quite as spooky. It's got some nice trees and a field of whatever this is supposed to be. It was just an asset I thought looked nice. Maybe it's wheat, corn, I don't know. Similar to how the witch will present you with stat upgrades, he can give you new cannons. As I mentioned earlier, right now I've just got the basic and a flaming cannon set up, but eventually he'll be able to offer you lots of unique weapons to change up your gameplay. At the moment, purchasing a cannon just replaces the first cannon on your ship, but in the future I'll add some UI where you can specifically choose which cannon you'd like to swap out. Even now, with how limited the system is, being able to sail around and shoot flaming cannonballs out of your ship is so fun. It's super satisfying, and I think this is a really good addition to the game. As I mentioned earlier, Hades does this thing where in the middle of a world you have an extra hard level or the mini-boss, and I've set up the first of those for my game. Here you'll stumble upon a little gated arena where upon sailing into it, the gates will close behind you and you'll face a few waves of increasingly difficult enemies. It's not exactly a mini-boss, it's more of an extra hard level, but I'll definitely be adding those in the future as well. I like this level because it's almost a nice reference to how the original game started, with just having this onslaught of waves of enemies, but this time they're limited, and once you defeat them all, you can move on to the next challenge. One of the next things I'll probably start working on is a boss for the first world theme. I won't quite yet get into the story and theming of the area, but I do have a basic narrative structure for the game already planned out in my head. For now though, I can give you a better look at the arena where the first boss fight will take place, and I also have a goofy placeholder ship for now. At the moment, I plan for this first boss being this rather large and intimidating ship, but I'll need to give it a much more interesting moveset than what it is now, which is just a basic ship, but large. Either way though, the boss is going to be guarding this shanty city area that I've already set up, and at this point you'll either sink and be sent back to the beginning of your run, or you'll be victorious, and maybe you'll get to interact with some shops in the city or something like that before you move on to the next themed world. So, I've been able to make a lot of progress on the game by adding new enemies, new features like unique cannon types, and a buff and debuff system. There's also now a basic game structure in place that more or less follows a roguelite structure. I think my next steps are going to be to really focus on creating interesting levels to pad out that first world, creating that first boss, and continuing to add a lot more enemy types. I'd really like to get the entirety of the first world finished and the gameplay more or less polished in the next couple of months, but hopefully that's not too lofty of a goal. We'll see. Anyway though, I'd like to thank you all very, very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. See you next time.